Smudge, written by Malcolm Young and Sonya Shaw, produced and narrated by Tarquin Young. When I bought Smudge, I was assured that his parents were two of the finest pedigree dogs in the county, and I thought that I had had quite a bargain. As an 11-year-old schoolboy, I had visions of that little bundle of fur, ears and eyes, someday becoming a Crufts champion. Therefore it came as something of a shock to discover that the farmer, whilst telling the truth about Smudge's parenthood, had not told the whole truth. His mother was one of the best cairn terriers not only in the county, but the entire country, and had numerous prizes to prove the fact. One evening, she happened to meet a rather rakish young member of the local pack of foxhounds and made the mistake of inviting him in to see her trophies. Unable to resist his seductive charms, the result was Smudge. In later years, we were to learn that in many ways, Smudge was just like his dad. But that's looking too far ahead. It was not long before his mixed ancestry showed itself in his appearance, and the result was a remarkably handsome animal. It really didn't matter at all that his legs and tail were twice as long as they should have been in proportion to his body, and the fact that one ear pointed down and the other up only added to his charm. His redeeming features were, without doubt, his lips. In spite of the feathery fingers of sideboards and beard, it was impossible not to notice them, for they were curiously mobile. When he laughed, which, having a great sense of humour, he did frequently, he would draw those thin, shining lips right back to reveal a mouthful of the whitest and crookedest teeth a dog ever possessed. I took the business of training Smudge very seriously and raided the public library for many learned and well-meaning books on how to care for your puppy and how to train your dog to do this and that and everything that well-brought-up dogs should know. It was at this time that we first realised that he very definitely had a mind of his own. He courteously rejected all attempts to train him to do anything, except that which he considered dignified or useful. In the matter of house training, I finally managed fairly well, and after thinking the question over for a few days, he agreed to desert my mother's best lounge Wilton in favour of my father's prize lawn. Solely for what could be made out of the deal, he learned to sit up and beg for titbits. This he did really well, effortlessly balancing himself with that huge tail, and on his own initiative pleading eloquently with enlarged sherry-brown eyes. His taste in food, as in other things, was very catholic. I really began to feel quite confident until that time came to introduce the collar and lead. I was quite looking forward to showing Smudge off to the village, but he took one look, decided that the contraption was way beneath his dignity, and sat firmly down and refused to move. Not all the pleas, treats, cajoleries and bribes in the world would make him change his mind, and none of the books on the subject offered a solution. As he ate his way through innumerable leads, collars, harnesses and bits of string over the ensuing weeks, my last resort was a choke chain. But by this time it was a very important matter of principle to Smudge, and he simply sat down again and made it quite obvious that he would prefer to be choked to death than give in. As I left to return all the books to the library, I saw him lying among the geraniums, pretending to be asleep, with a grin from ear to ear. He knew that he had won, and that I was no longer the master. Smudge was going his own way, and if I cared to, he really didn't mind if I strung along too. It's difficult to know how to describe my grandfather's dog, Mick, without it sounding totally incredible. Most greyhound, he was big, black, a walking skeleton, unbelievably ugly, and, in spite of it all, adorable. I never remember grandfather being without Mick, so he must have been quite an ancient when Smudge arrived, and time had done nothing to improve his appearance. What little hair he had left was speckled with white, and his right foreshoulder was completely bald, revealing some most unpleasant battle scars of bygone days. Several years previously, Mick had been run over by a motorcycle, and one of his back legs had been badly broken. Grandfather had insisted that it should be set in plaster, and although it healed and seemed to cause him no pain or inconvenience, it was as crooked as the proverbial crooked mile, so that he looked as though he had just limped out of a Thurber cartoon. Whatever Smudge thought of Mick's unprepossessing appearance, after an initial sniff and growl, they became firm friends. I shall never forget the look of utter astonishment on Smudge's face when he first saw Mick perform on a lamppost. Until this time, he had always managed perfectly well, puppy fashion, on all fours. But if this was the way of the big boys, he was quite willing to give it a try. He soon decided that Mick's way was far and away the best, and we learnt to our cost that his policy was practice makes perfect. Nothing was sacred. There was not a lamppost, gate or tree in the whole village that was not aimed at in the following weeks, so that one never ceased to wonder at the capacity of such a small dog. But he really did carry his exercise too far one day with the postmistress's leg. The notice that appeared on the post office door is there to this day. No dogs allowed. Somehow I felt the same about Miss Frank. As a devout, primitive Methodist, she should surely have turned the other leg. Aunt Hilary's pride and joy was her dining table. It had been in her family for several generations. When Smudge first saw it, he obviously agreed that there had never been such a beautiful table. I took note of a nasty gleam in his eye as he counted the 10 magnificently carved legs, and I determined to keep a close watch on him. But Smudge was a fast worker, and before I could stop him, he was off on the round. Before I had thought what to do, it was over, and he came skidding back to me for praise, his huge tail wagging in a riot of happiness and all his teeth displayed in a victorious grin, as though to say, "How about that? 10 out of 10. Things eased somewhat after that, but Smudge never allowed us to become complacent. On one occasion, he mysteriously appeared in church. I grabbed him in his progress down the aisle and was about to hustle him out when the vicar stopped everything and insisted that he should be allowed to stay. Was not he also one of God's creatures? Smudge grinned up at me, a positively saintly expression in his eyes and a sanctimonious droop to one of his pointed ears. It was with no small degree of trepidation that I approached the lectern to read the lesson with Smudge at my heels. I had never noticed until that moment how closely the base of the lectern resembled that of a lamppost. I had never witnessed such a show of hypocrisy as he sat at my feet, facing the congregation with his head slightly bowed. As I was reading the piece about, "And not a sparrow shall fall to the earth, but your Father in heaven shall see it," Smudge rose, and, fearing the worst, I tried to push him away with my foot. Somehow he made me look as though I had kicked him, and, emitting a very loud yelp, he hopped, in as bird-like a fashion as he could manage, out of the church. Only I saw him turn at the door and give me the wickedest smile that seemed to say, "Just didn't want you to forget my secret weapon." sped by, and I became an actor. I missed Smudge a great deal and envied the leading players who were allowed to bring their pets into theatres where dogs were not strictly allowed. The day eventually came when I became a leading man myself at the Theatre Royal in Bath, and I lost no time in fetching Smudge to share my glory. I should have remembered that where glory was concerned, he was not one to share. I suppose I had become accustomed to his face, and was surprised, if not a little offended, at the raised eyebrows and sniggers that his arrival caused. I was secretly pleased when he mistook my leading lady's chihuahua for a rat, and almost shook the life out of it. Of course, the inevitable happened, as it so frequently did with Smudge. He became stage-struck, and decided that it was time he made his first appearance. I had thought him safely ensconced in my dressing room, doing nothing more harmful than eating my makeup, when, in the middle of my most dramatic scene, the audience began to laugh. Some sixth sense made me turn around, and there, in the fireplace, he stood, grinning broadly and wagging his great tail. As if that in itself was not sin enough, he completely degraded me by making me chase him all over the stage, and the more the audience laughed, the wilder his antics became. It was his first appearance, and I made sure it was his last. Sad though it made me, the time had come for Smudge and I to part. He went to live with my sister and her family on a farm in a small Cotswold village. This might well seem to be the end of the story, but for Smudge, it was only the beginning. If anyone doubts that life begins at 40, listen on. My poor sister was never to know a quiet moment where the middle-aged Smudge was concerned. Smudge made his presence felt on the very first day. His arrival coincided with my small niece's birthday, but Smudge, not having been told, took it for granted that the bevy of little frilled and beribboned girls had been specially commissioned to herald his coming. Not one to be ungrateful, he decided to entertain them by allowing himself to be chased all over the house. It seemed harmless enough until screams and cries were heard to come from the dining room. Obviously, he had mistakenly thought that the birthday tea had also been provided in his honour, for there he stood in the centre of the table, meringue in mouth, 1 foot in a bowl of jelly, and giving the cream on the trifle an extra beating with that huge tail. He soon settled down to life on the farm, and even tried his hand as a sheepdog. The idea appealed to his bossy nature, but the mentality of the sheep exasperated him, and anyway, it was too much like hard work. So, he decided to become a gentleman farmer instead. It pleased him greatly when he was occasionally referred to as the Squire. He became the uncrowned king of the Cotswold Hills, and his fame, or rather infamy, soon spread far and wide. His life took on an ordered pattern. Every morning the Squire could be seen trotting jauntily along the vicarage for breakfast, and, after a routine inspection of the village, to the butcher's for lunch. In the afternoons he would usually arrange for my brother-in-law to drive him around in the Land Rover. Friday was Bank Day, which meant a trip into Stow-on-the-Wold and his visit to a friendly fishmonger. We were not Catholic, and I never did discover why he should have adopted that practice. Soon he was the best-known and best-loved dog in the area. He felt it his duty to take an active part in village life, and his privilege to be at the forefront of everything. At every gala occasion, Smudge was there, grinning broadly. When the annual fete was opened by the grand dame of the local gentry, Smudge stood in the centre of the platform, receiving the accolade of the crowd, as though he were an honoured guest. He felt that no procession was completely without himself at the head, tail beating time and ears very erect. Nor could there be a dance at the village hall without Smudge. He had tried to join in at first, but it was too great a strain on his nerves, so he sat out all the dances, except the Congo, which was his delight to lead. You will perhaps have noticed that until this time, Smudge had led a particularly sheltered and innocent life as regards to the opposite sex. One can only assume that his old friend Mick had admitted that part of his education. But Mick was in many ways very Victorian and probably did not like to talk about such things. But living on a farm, with it all going on around him, Smudge could hardly fail to notice. He had discovered a new interest in life, and with the aggrieved air of, "How long has this been going on?" took to it like the true-born son of the village Casanova that his father had been. No maiden or matron was safe from his advances, and indeed, such was his charm that I don't think many wanted to be. Pedigree or mongrel, it was all the same to Smudge. He loved them all. Feeling keenly that he had lost out in those years with me, he was determined to make up for it in the shortest possible time. Smudge met his big romance at the wedding of the year that was held in the village. All the creme de la creme were there, and mink and diamonds were the order of the day. Large marquees, liberally lined with primrose yellow satin, mushroomed forth in the grounds of the manor. Fortnum and Mason champagne flowed like Fortnum and Mason's champagne. Although he had not received a formal invitation, this did not deter Smudge. It was generally accepted in the village that he went where he pleased. He sauntered around, viewing the assembled guests with all the urbanity of one who knew himself to be at ease in all kinds of company. Suddenly, his eye lighted upon one very pretty white poodle. She was quite exquisite, very small, and with the haughty air of one who knows her pedigree to be impeccable. She was wearing a large yellow satin bow to show off that she, at least, was there officially. But Smudge was never one to allow such trifles to worry him. So, wasting no time, he made straight for her and began his usual rites of courtship. The poodle was somewhat nonplussed at such cavalier treatment, and her yellow bow quivered. "Oh, what a horrid little dog!" cried the mother of the bride, peering at Smudge through her diamond-studded lorgnette, and flicking him with the tail of her mink. Not one to be daunted, Smudge sat down and laughed, even deriving a certain sensual enjoyment from the blows being rained on him with best ranch mink. Angelique, for such was the poodle's name, was expediently removed from the scene by two liveried attendants. My sister, who had perjured her soul to perdition by denying all knowledge of Smudge, breathed a sigh of relief when he stalked off in the opposite direction with his nose in the air and his tail held at a very haughty angle. That supposedly was the end of the matter, and the only time that Smudge had been defeated. Knowing him as I did, I could have told them that he did not give in so easily. The following morning, they went to collect Angelique from the stable that had been her overnight prison. On opening the door, they were greeted by the triumphant grin of you-know-who. The poodle was lying languidly in the hay, her yellow bow a crumpled heap on the floor. The result was the prettiest little puppy imaginable that came to be known as Tiny Wee. Quite where the name came from, I never dared ask. It had never occurred to anyone that Smudge was getting old, and least of all to him. He always managed to retain his youthful appearance. Thus it was a tremendous shock when he suffered a severe stroke. The house was inundated with phone calls asking for bulletins, and it was not at all appreciated when the village wit asked solicitously if his speech was slurred. For days he just lay in his basket, staring pathetically at all efforts to help him. It was a beautiful day, that Friday in early March, with a strong hint of spring in the air after a long, hard winter. The vet called early and gave him some new tablets, but told my sister that he could not possibly last the day. The telephone rang and there was the inevitable, "About Smudge." My sister burst into tears. "I'm afraid he's slipping away." "Sorry, dear," came the friend's voice. "He's already slipped away. He's down here making advances to my Charlotte." However, from this time onwards, Smudge himself began to realise his increasing years and that there were limits to be observed. It made us very sad when it was reported that Smudge had been selling the courting rights of Cockle Street to one of his many grandsons. The grandson had been listening intently to the sage advice that Smudge was giving him. No one who witnessed the scene would ever have guessed him to be a grandfather, for in spite of his increasing deafness, he was still spry and retained his puppy-like enthusiasm for life, and outshone most younger dogs with his vitality. Angelique was quite an old lady, and still living in the village with her and Smudge's love child, Tiny Wee. We believe he was on his way to see them that evening, when he was killed, crossing the main road. The whole village mourned him, and he was accorded what almost amounted to a state funeral. I think everyone realised that it would be a long time before they saw his like again. I was thankful that it had been instantaneous, but I could not resist a little smile when they told me that it had been a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. It was somehow typical of him to die as he had lived. Only the best was good enough for Smudge. Smudge was written by Malcolm Young and Sonya Shaw. It was narrated and produced by Tarquin Young and is a Not So Easy Films production. It was recorded in our Malvern studios.